She was shaking when she limped up to the bench. 9-year-old Melissa didn't want money. She just wanted the burning pain in her metal leg to stop. She looked at the massive German shepherd guarding the officer and whispered, "Can I sit here?" She expected them to chase her away, but what the dog did next shocked everyone in the park. "Grab your coffee and stay with me," because this simple moment leads to a heartbreaking discovery. Please like the video and comment. I'm watching to see what happens next. It was hard to walk when your body didn't fit together right anymore because the metal leg Melissa wore was too small for her growing bones. She had been walking for 3 hours inside the city park because she wanted to exercise, but because she had nowhere else to go. Every time she took a step, the plastic cup of her prosthetic leg rubbed against her skin like sandpaper, creating a raw and angry sore that stung with every movement. Although the park was full of happy families and laughing children, Melissa felt like she was on a different planet, completely alone and invisible to everyone around her. She wore a faded pink t-shirt that had a small hole in the shoulder, and her jeans were worn out. But what people stared at was the metal pole where her lower leg used to be. She gripped the handles of her gray forearm crutches so tightly that her knuckles turned white, and sweat dripped down her forehead into her eyes. She was hungry, thirsty, and hurting so bad she wanted to cry. But she knew that crying made people look at you, and she just wanted to disappear. As she moved down the concrete path, she saw a wooden bench up ahead where a woman was sitting and reading a magazine. "Hello, my amazing friends and family. Welcome back to Vigilant Heart Tales. Before we jump deep into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing all your names and countries. And don't forget to check out the other stories on the channel. Tomorrow I've got another crazy one coming that I know you'll enjoy. All right, let's get into it. Melissa thought that maybe if she sat down for just 5 minutes, the fire in her leg would cool down. However, as she limped closer to the bench, the woman lowered her sunglasses and looked at Melissa's dirty clothes and the metal leg. Instead of smiling or moving over to make room, the woman frowned and quickly grabbed her large leather purse, pulling it into the empty space next to her as if she thought Melissa was going to steal it. That small action broke Melissa's heart more than the physical pain because it made her feel like she was garbage. She didn't say anything. She just lowered her head and kept moving, dragging her heavy legs forward while fighting back the tears that burned at her eyes. She needed to find a place to rest before she fell down, so she pushed herself toward the duck pond where it was usually quieter. That was when she saw him sitting there. There was a police officer on a green bench, drinking coffee and looking out at the water. He looked very serious and very strong, with broad shoulders and a uniform that looked perfectly pressed. But what made Melissa freeze in her tracks wasn't the officer. It was the massive German shepherd sitting at his feet. The dog looked powerful and dangerous, with pointy ears that twitched at every sound and eyes that watched everything like a hawk. Melissa had always been terrified of big dogs because her aunt told her they were mean. And she was also scared of the police because she thought they would take her away to a bad place. Her brain told her to turn around and run, but her leg gave a sharp jolt of pain that was so bad she gasped out loud. She knew she couldn't take another step without resting, so she had to make a choice between the pain and the fear. Since the pain was winning, she took a shaky breath and started to limp toward the officer and his dog. As she got closer, the big dog turned his head and locked his amber eyes on her. Melissa stopped moving because she was afraid he would bark or jump. But he didn't do either of those things. He just watched her with a calm curiosity. Even though her hands were shaking, Melissa forced herself to walk until she was standing right in front of the bench. The officer was looking at the water and didn't see her at first, so she stood there for a moment trying to find her voice. Finally, she whispered, "Can I sit here?" Her voice was so small that it almost disappeared in the wind. So she added, "My leg hurts." Officer Raphael Johnson turned his head slowly, expecting to see a tourist or an adult asking for directions. But instead, he saw a tiny, trembling girl who looked like she was carrying the weight of the world. He looked at her pale face, the sweat in her hair, and then his eyes traveled down to the crutches and the ill-fitting prosthetic leg. His heart instantly softened because he could see that she was suffering. He moved his radio to the side to make more space and smiled a genuine, warm smile. He said, "You don't have to ask, sweetheart. Take a load off. There's plenty of room." Melissa felt a wave of relief wash over her as she awkwardly lowered herself onto the bench, being careful not to bang her sore leg. She leaned her crutches against the wood and let out a long breath, finally taking the weight off her tired body. She reached down and rubbed her knee just above the plastic cup, trying to massage away the ache. For a moment, nobody spoke, and it was just the sound of the wind and the ducks. But then, the big dog moved. Melissa froze and pressed her back against the bench because she thought he was angry. Instead of growling, the dog stood up, took one slow step toward her, and gently rested his heavy head right on top of her good foot. He let out a long, happy sigh and closed his eyes, acting like her sneaker was the most comfortable pillow in the world. Raphael stared at his dog in total shock, because Rocky was a tough working dog who usually ignored everyone except his handler. He told Melissa softly he never does that. Rocky is all business when he has his vest on. Melissa looked down at the furry head resting on her foot and felt the warmth of his body seeping through her shoe. That warmth made her feel safe for the first time all day. She slowly reached out her hand and buried her dirty fingers in his soft neck fur. She whispered, "He feels warm." Raphael smiled at her, but as he watched her pet the dog, his police instinct started to kick in because he noticed things that were wrong. He saw that her t-shirt was too small and that she was way too thin for a growing girl. But what made his stomach turn was when her sleeve rode up as she reached for the dog. He saw dark purple bruises on her upper arm that looked like finger marks, as if someone had grabbed her too hard. He also noticed that the strap holding her leg on was frayed and looked incredibly uncomfortable. This wasn't just a tired kid. This was a child who was being neglected. He kept his voice very calm so he wouldn't scare her and asked, "Where are your parents, Melissa?" The change in her was instant. She stopped petting Rocky, and her shoulders hunched up as if she was expecting to be yelled at. She looked at the ground and lied, "They are working." Raphael knew it was a lie because he had been a cop for a long time, but he didn't call her out on it. Instead, he asked gently, "On a Sunday? That must be a tough job." Melissa didn't answer him, but a single tear escaped her eye and rolled down her cheek, landing on Rocky's black nose. The dog opened one eye, licked the tear away, and then nudged her hand with his wet nose as if to say it was okay to cry. That small act of kindness from an animal was too much for her to handle, and her walls started to crumble. She whispered, "They aren't working. They are in heaven." Raphael felt a pang of sadness in his chest and asked, "I am so sorry, Melissa. Who takes care of you now?" Melissa started to shake, and she reached into her pocket with a trembling hand. She pulled out a crumpled, dirty white envelope and handed it to him without looking up. She choked out the words, "My aunt." But she said, "I am too expensive." She said the insurance money for my leg ran out last month and she isn't a charity. Raphael felt a cold chill run down his spine as he took the envelope. He opened it and pulled out a single sheet of notebook paper. The handwriting was angry and jagged. He read the note which said, "I am done. I didn't sign up for a cripple. The medical bills are too high. Don't bring her back." It wasn't just a note, it was a confession of cruelty. This woman had abandoned a helpless child simply because the money had stopped coming in. Raphael felt a rage burning inside him that made him want to scream, but he looked at Melissa and knew he had to be calm for her. She was watching him with terrified eyes, waiting for him to tell her to leave just like the lady on the bench had done. She thought she was broken and unwanted. Rocky seemed to sense that Melissa was scared because he sat up and pressed his large body against her side, acting like a shield between her and the rest of the world. Raphael folded the note and put it in his pocket, making a silent promise that the woman who wrote it would answer for what she did. He turned his body toward Melissa and placed his large, warm hand over her trembling hands. He looked her right in the eyes and said with total conviction, "Melissa, look at me. You are not expensive. You are not a burden. And you are definitely not a problem." Melissa's lip quivered and she asked in a tiny voice, "But where will I go?" She changed the locks. Raphael shook his head and said, My shift is over in 10 minutes, and I am not leaving you here. You are not walking another step on that leg today." He reached for his radio and called for a medical transport, not because it was an emergency, but because he wanted her to be treated like a princess. As they waited for the ambulance, Melissa asked him, "Will you stay with me?" Raphael replied, "I promise I won't leave your side." For the first time since her parents died, Melissa didn't feel alone. She had a protector and a furry friend, and even though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring, she knew she wouldn't have to face it by herself. As the sun began to set over the park, casting long shadows across the grass, the officer, the girl, and the dog sat together on the bench, looking less like strangers and more like a family that was just beginning to form. Raphael stared at the crumpled piece of paper in his hand, feeling the world stop spinning around him because the words written on that napkin were not just cruel, they were criminal. Although he had seen terrible things in his 15 years as a police officer, reading that a guardian had abandoned a child simply because the money ran out made his stomach turn with a sickness he couldn't hide. The note said she was too expensive and too much work, but when Raphael looked down at Melissa, he didn't see a burden. He saw a terrified little girl who was waiting for him to confirm that she was unwanted. However, he knew that if he showed his anger now, she would think he was mad at her. So he took a deep breath and forced his hands to stop shaking. Melissa was watching his face closely, her lower lip trembling as she waited for the rejection she was used to. But Raphael slowly folded the note and placed it securely in his pocket. He leaned forward, placing his elbows on his knees so he could look her right in the eye. And he spoke with a voice that was soft yet as solid as a rock. He told her that adults sometimes make big mistakes, but she was not a mistake, and she was certainly not expensive in the way that mattered. Melissa asked him in a tiny voice what would happen to her now since she didn't have a key to get back inside. And Raphael reached out to gently cover her small, cold hand with his large, warm one. He promised her that she would never have to go back to that house where she wasn't wanted. And although he didn't have all the answers yet, he knew one thing for sure, which was that he wasn't leaving her alone on this bench. Rocky seemed to understand the gravity of the promise because the big dog pressed his side firmer against Melissa's leg, offering her a physical reminder that she was safe. Raphael grabbed his radio to call for help, but instead of calling for a regular patrol car that might scare her, he requested a medical transport because he wanted her to be treated with care, not like a suspect. While they waited for the ambulance, Melissa ate the rest of the granola bar Raphael gave her, eating it so quickly that it broke his heart because it was clear she hadn't had a proper meal in a long time. He asked her about school and her friends, trying to keep her mind off the pain in her leg, and she told him that she liked to read because books didn't stare at her leg. This made Raphael smile, but inside he was already planning the next steps because he knew the system could be cold and slow, and he refused to let this girl get lost in the paperwork. When the ambulance arrived with its flashing lights, Melissa panicked for a moment, gripping the edge of the bench until her knuckles turned white because she thought they were taking her to a bad place. However, Raphael stood up and held out his hand, telling her that he was coming with her and that Rocky was coming too. The paramedics were confused at first about the dog, but when they saw the look on Raphael's face and the way Rocky was guarding the girl, they didn't argue. They lifted Melissa onto the stretcher, and for the first time in hours, the pressure was off her sore leg. She let out a long sigh of relief that turned into a yawn because the exhaustion was finally catching up to her. Inside the ambulance, Raphael sat right beside her, holding her hand the entire way, while Rocky sat on the floor with his ears perked up, watching every move the paramedics made. Raphael texted his wife, Elena, telling her that something important had happened and that he needed her to meet him at the hospital. He knew Elena would understand because they had been praying for a child for years, and although they had discussed adoption, they never imagined it would happen like this. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors were kind and gentle, but when they took off Melissa's old prosthetic leg, the room went silent. The skin underneath was raw and infected because the device was 2 sizes too small, which meant she had been walking on an open wound for weeks. Raphael had to look away to keep from crying, but Melissa didn't cry because she was used to the pain, which was perhaps the saddest part of all. The doctor said she would need antibiotics and a few days of rest, but she would be okay physically. However, the emotional scars were what worried Raphael the most. A social worker named Mrs. Miller arrived an hour later, looking tired and carrying a thick folder of papers. She pulled Raphael into the hallway to talk, and her face was grim as she explained that they had located the aunt. It turned out the woman had already left town, but the police had intercepted her at the bus station thanks to the note Raphael provided. Mrs. Miller said the aunt would face charges for abandonment and neglect. But then came the hard news. She told Raphael that since Melissa had no other living relatives, she would have to go into the foster care system once she was discharged from the hospital. Raphael felt a cold knot in his stomach because he knew that the foster system was overcrowded and that older children with disabilities often had a very hard time finding permanent homes. He looked through the glass window of the room and saw Melissa asleep in the hospital bed, looking so small in the crisp white sheets, with Rocky sleeping on the floor right next to her bed. He knew he couldn't let her go into the system, where she might feel unwanted again. Just then he heard the sound of footsteps rushing down the hall and turned to see his wife, Elena, running toward him. She looked worried, but when Raphael explained the story, telling her about the park, the note, and how Rocky had chosen the girl, Elena's expression softened. She walked to the window and looked at Melissa, and then she looked at Raphael with tears in her eyes. She didn't need to say a word because Raphael knew that look, as it was the same look she gave him when they decided to buy their house, a look of absolute certainty. They walked into the room together, and when Melissa woke up a few minutes later, she looked frightened to see a stranger. But Elena smiled the warmest, kindest smile Melissa had ever seen, and introduced herself simply as Raphael's friend. Over the next few days, Raphael and Elena never left Melissa's side, taking turns sleeping in the chair next to her bed so that she would never wake up alone. They brought her books, new clothes that actually fit, and good food that made her cheeks turn pink again. The bond between Melissa and Rocky grew stronger every hour, and the nurses joked that the dog was a better medicine than anything they had in the pharmacy. Whenever Melissa had to get a shot or have her dressing changed, she would bury her face in Rocky's neck, and the dog would stand perfectly still, absorbing her fear. Finally, the day came for Melissa to leave the hospital, and the social worker came in with a clipboard to discuss her placement. Melissa looked terrified, clutching the bedsheets because she thought she was being sent away to a stranger's house. However, Raphael stepped forward and placed a hand on her shoulder, looking at the social worker with a determined expression. He announced that they had already filled out the emergency foster paperwork and that Melissa was coming home with him. Melissa's eyes went wide, and she asked if he was serious, hardly daring to believe it. Elena sat on the edge of the bed and told her that they had a room with a big window that was waiting just for her, and that Rocky needed his new best friend to come home so he could show her the backyard. Melissa started to cry, but this time they were happy tears, the kind that wash away the dirt and the hurt. They left the hospital together, not as a police officer and a victim, but as a family that was just starting to heal. The ride to Raphael's house was quiet, but it was a peaceful quiet. When they pulled into the driveway, Melissa saw a nice house with a big tree in the front yard, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she might actually belong somewhere. The first few weeks were an adjustment because Melissa was still waiting for the other shoe to drop, expecting them to get tired of her or send her back when things got hard. But they didn't. When she had nightmares about the accident, Raphael was there to sit with her until she fell back asleep. When she struggled with her schoolwork because she had missed so much class, Elena sat with her for hours, patiently helping her catch up. And through it all, Rocky was her constant shadow, following her from room to room and sleeping on the rug beside her bed every single night. 6 months later, the season had changed from autumn to a beautiful, blooming spring. If you went back to that same city park, you might see a family playing catch near the pond. Raphael was there not in his uniform, but in jeans and a t-shirt, laughing as he threw a bright orange ball for Rocky. Elena was setting up a picnic on a blanket, cutting sandwiches into triangles just the way Melissa liked them. And there, running through the grass, was Melissa. She wasn't limping anymore, and she wasn't hiding in the shadows. She had a brand new prosthetic leg that was fitted perfectly by a specialist, and it had a cool design with stars on it that she had picked out herself. She was moving fast, chasing the dog and laughing a sound that was pure joy. She stopped to catch her breath, and her eyes fell on the bench where she had sat that day, the bench where she had thought her life was over. She remembered how cold and invisible she had felt, but then she looked at Raphael, who was waving at her, and she realized that she was seen. She ran over to him, not walking, but running, and wrapped her arms around his waist in a tight hug. He hugged her back, lifting her up and spinning her around while Rocky barked happily and jumped around them. She looked at Raphael and called him Dad, a word that felt heavy and sweet on her tongue. He kissed the top of her head and told her that he was proud of her. As they sat down to eat their lunch, people walked by and smiled at them, seeing just a normal, happy family enjoying a sunny day. Nobody knew that they had been brought together by a painful past and a very special dog. As Melissa took a bite of her sandwich, she reached down to pet Rocky, who was resting his head on her new leg, just like he had done on the old one. She whispered a thank you to him, and although he couldn't speak, his tail gave a gentle thump against the grass. The sun was shining, her leg didn't hurt, and her heart was full. She realized that family isn't always about whose blood you have, but about who is willing to hold your hand when you can't walk, and who is willing to sit with you on a bench when the rest of the world walks by. The fear was gone, replaced by love, and Melissa knew that she would never have to ask if she could sit there again, because she already knew the answer was yes, forever. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you enjoyed this story, I promise you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more thrilling as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.